Today, I'm going to be talking about a very underrated series that barely anyone talks about or mentions. And this particular show is... So, let's get started. Spider-Man Unlimited was a show that first aired on Fox Kids on October 2nd in the year 1999. And although it wasn't near as successful as the 90s animated series, it still was a pretty good show in my opinion. Also, this version of Spider-Man is voiced by Rino Romano, which is one of my favorite voice actors for Spider-Man. Now, I've heard a lot of talk about this series being inspired off of Spider-Man 2099. And yeah, I kinda see what they're talking about, especially with the futuristic setting of everything. This was a very different Spider-Man TV series. Like, if you're just a casual fan watching, yeah, this might be a turn off for you. But I'm going to be reviewing this series from start to finish. So without further ado, let's get right into the review. So the episode starts out with John Jameson going on a one-man mission to Counter Earth, which Counter Earth was discovered 6 months before this. But before the space probe was able to get more footage, it got destroyed in the process. Meanwhile, we get to see Peter Parker, and Peter Parker is just doing Peter Parker stuff, just taking pictures. Then after that, Peter's spider sense goes off, and then suits up to see what the issue is. And it turns out that Venom and Carnage is here, and they're heading straight towards John Jameson's spaceship. So he dashes towards the spaceship to try to stop Venom and Carnage. But there is just one confusing thing to me. How are they able to become complete goo even though they are attached to human host? Yeah, I don't get how that works, but they revealed that their plan is to go to Counter Earth and take it over and rule over this symbiote hive mind called the Synoptic. Which the Synoptic has been on Counter Earth for no telling how many years now. But then Venom and Carnage hijacks John Jameson's spaceship. And yeah, we already know how J. Jonah Jameson is gonna take it. He's gonna blame Spider-Man, which he does. Then some military guards come after him to try to apprehend him. But it doesn't work and he escapes. So everyone thinks that John Jameson is dead now. And they think that Spider-Man had something to do with it. And yeah, things get so much worse after this. So it's only been a week since the incident and things have gone into complete chaos. And every single person in New York has completely turned on Spider-Man. And now Jameson is offering $10 million for someone to catch him. But shortly after that though, he rescues a woman and her baby from a burning building. But despite Spider-Man just saving a woman and her child, these firefighters have the nerve to blast to a water hose. Like, are you serious? He just saved people and you're still trying to blame him for everything? Wow. That kind of sucks, not gonna lie. But despite all of that, he saves the firefighter anyways. But everybody thinks that Spider-Man has supposedly died now. 4 hours later, he goes to MJ's house and yeah, she's just glad that he's safe after all of that craziness. Then in the morning when they wake up, they hear about what happened on the news and basically saying how Spider-Man gave his life to the city, despite everyone thinking that he was the bad guy. And then Peter thinks about giving up being Spider-Man for a moment until Mary Jane says that he can still make a difference even if he's not Spider-Man. Then shortly after that, a message gets sent back to Earth that John Jameson is still alive. So Peter comes up with a plan to save him. So 6 months have passed since the disappearance of John Jameson. And now he's ready to go to Counter Earth with his new nanotech suit. And yeah, I really like the fact that the writers came up with this nanotech concept, especially considering that this is the Fantastic Four's technology that Peter is using. So he heads towards the spaceship until he is stopped by Nick Fury. And it was interesting that we got to see Nick Fury in this series. And at first he tries to stop Spider-Man from getting on the shuttle, but then he proves that he's the real Spider-Man, and then Nick Fury lets him go. So yeah, cool and brief cameo from Nick Fury. And now it's time to really get into this review. So, Spider-Man crash lands on Counter Earth. And yeah, we finally get to see what Counter Earth looks like. But as soon as he gets there, he is attacked by these robots. Then he gets pursued by the enforcers of this planet called the Knights of Wundagore. But I'll talk about them soon enough. So after a long chase from the Knights of Wundagore, they finally catch Spider-Man by knocking him unconscious. And then whenever he wakes up, he's in this strange lab. And they try to obtain a DNA sample from him, but before they are able to do that, he escapes. And now this is where we get to the characters. So first I'm gonna start off with Lord Tiger. So Lord Tiger just used to be a regular tiger that lived on Earth until he got brought to Counter Earth and experimented on and got turned into a bestial. Compared to all of the other Knights of Wundagore, Lord Tiger for the most part is really calm and collected, and is almost never seen fighting with humans. I would say Lord Tiger is my favorite out of the four. Now let's talk about Lady Vermin. Now Lady Vermin is pretty much like a Counter Earth version of Black Cat in a sense, and the fact that she has a huge thing for Spider-Man. Other than that, that's pretty much it for her character. Now let's talk about Lady Ursula. So Lady Ursula is pretty much the strongest one out of the four. She has enhanced strength, all the powers of a bestial. She has sharp teeth and claws that can cut through the strongest of metal. And yeah, she's pretty much like a punch first, ask questions later type of character. But yeah, that's about it for Lady Ursula. So last and certainly not least, let's talk about Saram. So Saram is the most ruthless out of all of the four. He's cold-hearted, unsympathetic, and shows no mercy towards the humans of Counter Earth. So yeah, Saram is the worst. And finally, the one who started this all, the High Evolutionary. So the High Evolutionary is a scientist that came to Counter Earth, and he pretty much got so disgusted with the things that was going on Earth that he decided to come to Counter Earth, but only saw the exact same things. So he vowed to make his own beast people that was only loyal to him, and they're pretty much the dominant species of Counter Earth, while the humans there are just treated like low-class citizens. So let's talk about John Jameson. So John Jameson is now the leader of the underground human resistance. So I'm not sure how long he's been leader now, but I guess it's been a significant amount of time. Honestly, this is the only version of John Jameson that seems interesting, because all of the other iterations of John Jameson just seem kind of bland and generic. But this John Jameson feels more fleshed out and organic, and he also has an interesting character arc that I will talk about later on in the video. So now let's talk about Karen. So Karen is the main supporting character out of the human resistance. She's tough and knows how to hold her own in a fight. And she also had her own character arc later on in the series. So now let's talk about Bromley. So gadgets wise, I would say Bromley is the best at making gadgets. Like when it comes down to pursuits, he's really good at keeping people away. And his backstory is that he's one of the oldest resistant fighters ever to be known. And he lost his brother and hoped to find him one day. So yeah, that's pretty much about it for Bromley. And now let's talk about the side story. So at the end of episode 2 of Spider-Man Unlimited, Peter has nowhere to stay. So he stays with his doctor and her son, Dr. Naoko and Shang Yamada Jones. And he meets them shortly after he saves Shang from the Enforcer's Machine Man. And I really like the side story for Shang and Naoko, because it turns out that Naoko has an estranged husband that used to work alongside the Resistance and still keeps tabs on them, and gets really jealous whenever he sees Peter with them. So yeah, the side story was pretty decent for the most part. So now I'm going to be talking about all the Counter Earth versions of the Spidey villains. But if you want to view your own personal favorite parts, then the link's in the description. The choice is entirely up to you guys. But with that out the way, let's get right into it. So in episode 3 of Spider-Man Unlimited, we are introduced to the Counter Earth version of Green Goblin. And yeah, Spider-Man encounters Goblin after Naoko gets kidnapped by this green tentacle thing. And Shang sees all this and tells Spider-Man about it. So whenever Spider-Man encounters Goblin, he assumes that he had something to do with it. So they fight, and then they later on come to an agreement to work together so that they can help find Shang and Naoko. And here's an interesting fact. So not only does Rano Romano voice Spider-Man, but he also voices Green Goblin as well. And did a pretty okay job voicing him in my opinion. But the bat-like wings that this Counter Earth Goblin has kinda reminds me of the 2099 Goblin, just a little bit. But unlike his regular counterpart, this Goblin is a hero instead of a villain. And strangely enough, Goblin connects with Shang and Naoko's story, because it turns out that Counter Earth Goblin is the husband of Naoko and the father of Shang, aka Hector Jones, aka Green Goblin. Wow. Yeah, I was late on this. But that does explain why he randomly said "my love" at the end of episode 3. So Green Goblin, or Hector Jones' backstory, is that at some point he joined the Human Resistance. And Naoko pointed out that the more time that he spent with the Human Resistance, the more withdrawn he seemed whenever he came back home. And she pointed out that he stayed locked away working on gadgets. But then one day he just disappeared and never came back and left a note saying he was doing it for them. But yeah, pretty interesting and fleshed out backstory for Counter Earth Goblin. So now I'm going to be talking about a character that's a member of the Human Resistance, and his name is Git. So in this episode, we get to see the tragic backstory of Git. And his story is that whenever he was a kid, that he got kidnapped and experimented on by Saram. So much to where he became living bandages and got treated like an outcast because of it, which was really sad and messed up. And you just can't help but to feel sorry for the character. And I think this episode shows how truly messed up Saram actually is. Like, he basically ruined Git's life forever. So the plot of this episode is that Git gets a hold to a bomb, like a very deadly bomb, a bomb that can mutate everyone and potentially destroy the entire city. So Spider-Man and the Human Resistance have to team up with the Knights of Wondergore to stop this from happening. So they work together and they convince Git to give back the bomb, instead of taking out his hate on everybody else in the city. But he manages to get a little revenge by beating up Saram for what he did to him all those years ago. And the backstory was good and all, but I feel like that it didn't get enough time to develop due to the series getting cancelled. And yeah, that's about it for Git. So I would say that this version of Peter Parker has the typical traits of a Peter Parker. He's calm, quiet, and reserved, and sometimes even doubts himself, and still sometimes contemplates on whether he should be Spider-Man or not. But on his downtime, whenever he's not with the Human Resistance, he's just hanging with Shang and Naoko. And whenever he's not doing that, he's just taking pictures at the Counter Earth Daily Bugle. Yeah, Counter Earth has his own Daily Bugle, and Peter becomes a new photographer there as well. But his motivations in this series is to get back home to MJ, since he's stranded on Counter Earth now, which was a pretty good solid motivation for Peter. Another storyline that I really liked in this series was the one with X-51, because he was one of the many of the Machine Man that was about to get turned into scrap, until Spider-Man took him out of that place after he rescued Shane. But unlike all the rest of the Machine Man, he ended up gaining sentience and breaking his programming. And then later on in that episode, he ends up joining the Human Resistance. Then when he gets repaired, he becomes a really valiant member there. So yeah, I would say that X-51 is one of the more interesting characters. Now, in this series, Venom and Carnage is just mostly fixated on achieving their goal, and that is to take over the Synoptic. But they don't really seem to be too concerned about Spider-Man. If anything, he's just an every now and then interference to them. Now, Venom in this series is just typical Venom, while Carnage in this series seems a lot more focused. Although I would say that he's still pretty insane. But yeah, that's about it for Venom and Carnage. So, in this episode, we are introduced to the Counter Earth version of Kraven, but on Counter Earth, they just call him the Hunter. And Counter Earth's the Hunter is pretty similar to regular Kraven, besides the obvious differences with his appearance, like with his ponytail and the fact that he's not Russian, and just some other minor differences. Now, the plot of this episode is that the Hunter was hired by the High Evolutionary to capture or just eliminate Spider-Man. And just for good measure, he creates this toxic formula that enhances his speed, strength, and agility, and gives him animal-like senses on top of that. But there is a downside to the formula. So this formula greatly decreases the Hunter's lifespan, and it poisons his bones and liver, which is not a good way to go. But according to the Hunter, it was a necessary sacrifice to gain power so that he could take out Spider-Man. Then Spider-Man and Hunter have a fight, and his plan fails. Even with all that strength that the formula gave him, he still lost against Spider-Man. Then Spider-Man turns his own weapons against him and threatens the Hunter by saying if he ever comes after him again, that he'll reveal his secret. And yeah, that's about it for this episode. So, in this episode, we get to see the Counter Earth version of Vulture. And yeah, this Vulture is a vigilante slash hero, just like the Counter Earth Goblin. And I really like this episode because we get to see the backstory of Vulture. And his backstory is that in his youth, he used to work alongside the Bestials and occasionally messed around with humans. But there was this one particular human that he was friends with, and his name was Cliff. And apparently they were best friends for a long time. But that all changed one night whenever his friends told him to go to this place. But he didn't know what was going on. But as soon as he found out, he knew it wasn't right. But out of pure pressure, he does it anyways. But his friend gets hurt in the process. And ever since that day, he vowed to become a superhero that defends humans from Bestials. And we also briefly get to see a team up between Spider-Man and Vulture. And they free all the innocent civilians that was captured by the Bestials. But the thing about this Vulture is that, unlike his regular counterpart, he has powers with or without his suit. And I really like the design choice that they went with for this version of Vulture. And yeah, I would say that this episode was pretty decent. But now it's time to move on to another episode. So in this episode, we get to see ManWolf, and he just starts destroying everything at Naoko's clinic until Spider-Man shows up and tries to stop him. So they have a fight in the clinic, and once Spider-Man finally gets him and then tries to finish him off, Naoko stops him, and she tells Spider-Man to hold him off a little longer. But then when the sun rises, it turns out that ManWolf is John Jameson. And yeah, this whole ManWolf situation is the character arc of John Jameson. So it turns out shortly after he got to Counter Earth that he got experimented on and captured by the High Evolutionary. And his plan was to try to turn him into a bestial, but before the process was finished, he escaped. But then later on in this episode, we get to see Counter Earth Electro. And I have to say, this is very interesting, because this Electro is not too much different from regular Electro, besides the obvious difference with him being an electric eel and all. But towards the end of the episode, John Jameson becomes ManWolf again. Meanwhile, Spider-Man and Electro is still fighting. Then Electro reveals his motive, and apparently he wants to be the 5th member of the Knights of Wondergore. Then after that, Spider-Man defeats Electro. But then as soon as he gets back up and powers up for round 2, ManWolf is there. Then he gets caught in the crossfire. Then he gets overloaded and literally disappears. And I can only assume that he became pure energy afterwards. But yeah, I would say this episode was pretty solid. I like how we got to see Counter Earth Electro and ManWolf in this episode. And I like how it ties into John Jameson's story arc with him being ManWolf. But yeah, that's about it for this episode. And now it's time to move on. So in this episode, we get to see Venom again, and he is hunted and tracked down by one of the High Evolutionary's scientists, and they forcefully detach the symbiote from him. And then Spider-Man hears Venom screaming in pain, and whenever he goes down, he just sees Eddie Brock detached from the Venom symbiote. So we get to see a flashback sequence of this version of Spider-Man's Black Suit storyline. And I like the fact that they did this because certain things that happened was very similar to the 90s animated series, while also being vastly different at the same time. And I really like the references and callbacks that this series makes to the 90s animated series. And another interesting thing about this version of the Symbiote Saga is that Eddie Brock gets taken in by S.H.I.E.L.D. instead of the police. And in this version, he chooses to turn Cletus Cassidy into Carnage. And apparently, they always been buddy-buddy in this version of the story. And Spider-Man pointed out that Eddie Brock has been attached with the Venom symbiote for years now. So I'm assuming it's been like 4 to 5 years in this universe now, and his condition is so bad to where if he's not bonded back with the Venom symbiote, he'll die. Meanwhile, Carnage goes on a rampage to look for Venom. Then Spider-Man and Carnage have a fight at this subway, and then Carnage demands to know where Venom is. Then Spider-Man finds the Venom symbiote and saves it by bonding with it temporarily. So we get to see Spider-Man back in black with the Venom symbiote. But although he wore it briefly, it was still pretty cool to see regardless. But then shortly after that, Eddie Brock gets reunited with the Venom symbiote. Then he becomes Venom once again. I would say this episode was one of my favorite episodes out of the series because I like the fact that Eddie Brock had a character arc in this episode, because it showed Eddie not wanting to be with the symbiote anymore and just wanting to be a normal human, despite the fact that he was about to die soon. And he even go as far as to protect Shang and Naoko whenever they are endangered by Carnage. But overall, I really did like this episode. It was really good. And I would say this episode is up there with one of my favorite episodes of the series. But anyways, guys, that's about it for this one. So right before I get into the finale part of things, I'm going to be talking about the suits right about now. So, how would I describe this suit in words? It's awesome, amazing, and spectacular. The suit was very well done, and I like the fact that they drew inspiration from the Steve Ditko Spider-Man comics. But the only difference is they amplified it to the max. Like, they managed to make the suit look even better than before. The shading is on point, the color is on point. Everything about this suit is on point, especially the yellow lenses. But I also noticed that they gave him the web pits, which was interesting. But now it's time to talk about the Nano Suit. So the nanotech suit. The nanotech suit is one of my favorite Spider-Man suits of all time because I like the fact that it's so different and unique compared to the other Spider-Man suits. And the shading is really well done. It looks so vibrant and cool looking. So now let's get into the abilities of this suit. So first off, this suit has a built-in stealth mode, which he can use to hide from enemies. He also has a built-in sonic weapon that was specifically created to combat symbiotes. He also has these spider darts that he uses a lot in fights, and he has a spider tracer on top of that. But here's a really interesting feature. So he's able to summon a remote control spider suit with just a flick of a button on his watch, which is a pretty neat feature. Now, I noticed a lot of people dislike the suit because of the cape, but I think that it adds on to the uniqueness of it. Honestly, this feels like a bonus suit that you would unlock in a video game. So yeah, this suit was great, and everything about this suit was great, and I like the fact that it was so vibrant and detailed. But anyways guys, that's about it for this suit. Now it's time to move on to the next one. So, in my personal opinion, I would say that the Symbiote suit is absolutely legendary. Like, this suit is truly incredible, and I really like the fine shading and blue detailing in it. And I also like the fact that they made this suit full on comic book accurate. And although its screen time was really brief, it still was a treasure to look at. And I would say out of all the suits in this series, this one was the best. But now it's time to get to the finale. So in the season finale of Spider-Man Unlimited, the High Evolutionary starts to order every single person out of their homes. Then the Machine Man just randomly start arresting people that they think are rebels of the human resistance. And to make matters worse, Venom and Carnage's master plan is now set into motion. And now they plan to set off the Synoptic. Then Spider-Man and the human resistance, and also Venom and Carnage, gets captured by the High Evolutionary. And then Spider-Man breaks everyone out, and they fight with the Knights of Wundagore. And then Spider-Man defeats the High Evolutionary. And now they're on their way to free Eddie Brock and Cletus Cassidy. And then Lord Tiger lets them go. And when they break Eddie and Cletus out, they reveal that it's already too late and their plan has been set into motion. Then the Synoptic gets unleashed. Wait, that's it? What? So, unfortunately, during that time, Fox Kids didn't get enough viewers with the show, and plus it was overshadowed by Pokemon and Digimon at that. So sadly, Fox Kids had no choice but to cancel Spider-Man Unlimited. So I will give this overall series a 7 out of 10. Well guys, that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the review, and if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.